In the dead of night, while the world slept, a truth was about to be uncovered, one so terrifying, so insidious, that it could shake the very foundation of everything we believe. But the real question was, why did no one who got too close to it ever live to tell the tale? The morning sun filtered through the lace curtains, casting restless patterns of shifting light and shadow against the faded floral wallpaper of Miss Evelyn Harrow's sitting room. A breeze, carrying the fragrance of damp earth and late-blooming roses, rustled the delicate doilies resting on the polished mahogany, momentarily disturbing the stillness of the room. Augustine's Hollow was not a place where time hurried. Its quiet lanes and weathered cottages held whispers of past scandals, missing jewelry, hushed affairs, and the occasional unsolved enigma that lingered in the town's collective memory. But today, something far more unsettling disrupted that measured rhythm. Miss Harrow, seated with the unruffled grace of one who had long learned to listen more than she spoke, lifted a delicate china cup to her lips. The tea had long since cooled, forgotten the instant she had unfolded the morning paper. Her eyes, keen as a hawk's despite the gold-rimmed spectacles resting on the bridge of her nose, remained locked on a single headline, the only thing in the sea of ink that mattered: tragedy on the tracks, engineer among 5 dead in high-speed train disaster. A terrible business, the words pressing into her mind as she traced a steady finger over the grainy photograph of the wreckage: mangled steel, thick plumes of smoke, the twisted skeleton of what had once been a marvel of modern progress. She had never placed much trust in the reckless speed of the modern world. Some things were meant to be understood before they were rushed, and yet it was not the disaster itself that unsettled her, but a name hidden among the list of casualties: Harvey Thorne. There was a familiarity there, elusive yet nagging, like an unfinished sentence lingering at the edge of her mind. Her thoughts reeled back to the bridge club last month, to Mrs. Abbott's offhand remark about a certain railway engineer, brilliant but distant, lost in endless calculations, and whispered concerns about safety. Her nephew, employed at the very same railway, had mentioned him too. Always scribbling, always muttering under his breath about deadlines, about things that weren't quite right. Evelyn's lips pressed into a thin line. She did not deal in careless speculation, that was the folly of the naive. But years of quiet observation had taught her that the world rarely dealt in true accidents, and something about this so-called mechanical failure, did not sit right. The train had been a prototype, an ambitious step toward a future of unimaginable speed and efficiency. It was set to launch within months, meant to redefine travel as the world knew it. But its trial run had ended in disaster, in death, in an official statement that was a little too convenient, a little too neatly packaged. Evelyn folded the paper with meticulous precision and set it aside. The clock on the mantel chimed softly, marking the hour, its measured ticking a reminder that time, no matter how fast one tried to make it move, could never outrun the truth. In the distance, a train whistle pierced the still morning air, a long mournful sound that carried with it the weight of something unfinished. She sat in silence, fingers absently smoothing the soft grey yarn in her lap, before reaching for her knitting needles. "A dreadful thing," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper, "and yet, I do believe I shall have to look into it." A faint smile flickered at the corners of her lips, for she knew that the truth, much like a delicate thread, always had a way of unraveling when pulled just right. She had barely set down her knitting when a sudden knock echoed through the room. 2 firm raps, a pause, then a third, hesitant one. Uncertainty, doubt. She recognized it immediately. Rising with practiced ease, she smoothed the creases from her skirt and moved toward the door, the grandfather clock's steady ticking accompanying each step. The scent of lingering Earl Grey still hung in the air, as she turned the handle and opened the door to a man who seemed to carry the weight of something unspoken. His suit was finely tailored, but rumpled, worn with the careless disarray of someone who had slept little and thought too much. Albert Thorne. She had seen him before, perhaps at a town gathering, perhaps outside the railway offices in London, where he handled the contracts for the company behind the doomed train. There was a nervousness in his stance, in the way his fingers gripped the brim of his hat, just a touch too tightly. "Miss Harrow," he said, his voice carefully measured, though she heard the strain beneath. "Forgive me for intruding." "You're not intruding," she replied smoothly, her voice a soft invitation. "Not if I invite you in." He hesitated for only a breath, before stepping over the threshold, like a man stepping onto ground he was no longer sure would hold him. And as she closed the door behind him, Miss Harrow already knew this was only the beginning. The morning light filtered through the narrow panes of Miss Eleanor Hayes' drawing room, painting shifting patterns over the lace-covered settee and the antique bureau that held neatly stacked letters, a porcelain inkwell, and a delicate silver letter opener. The scent of lavender and aged parchment filled the air, but something else lingered, a sense of something unresolved, something just beyond the reach of the ordinary. The newspaper lay open beside her cooling tea, her gloved fingers resting lightly on the edge, as her sharp, calculating eyes scanned the front page. "Tragedy on the Iron Line, engineer among the dead," the headline declared, a grainy photograph of twisted steel and scorched earth beneath it. The official account spoke of mechanical failure, an unfortunate mishap during a test run of the much-anticipated high-speed rail. But Miss Hayes had lived long enough to recognize when truth had been neatly folded away in favor of convenience. Her gaze flickered to a single name in the list of casualties, Samuel Hargrove. It took only a moment for her mind, quick as a blade, to recall where she had heard it before. Mrs. Langley, the postmaster's wife, had spoken of him just a fortnight ago, her voice lowered in the conspiratorial whisper of one who delighted in knowing things others did not. A brilliant man, she had said, but troubled of late, kept to himself, always scribbling in that little book of his, muttering about deadlines and risks no one would listen to. A faint furrow appeared between Miss Hayes' brows. Risks. The word lingered in her thoughts like a puzzle missing its final piece. Outside, the distant whistle of a train carried through the crisp morning air, a sound both ordinary and ominous in its timing. She had just set the newspaper aside, when a firm knock echoed through the quiet of her home. 3 taps, 2 measured, 1 hesitant, a caller unsure of his welcome. She rose, smoothing the pleats of her modest but impeccably tailored dress, and made her way to the door. The man who stood there was lean, his suit fine but ill-fitted, as though he had lost weight in recent days. Julian Hargrove. The resemblance to the man in the paper was unmistakable, though grief had etched deep lines into his features. "Miss Hayes," he began, voice carefully composed, though his hands betrayed him, clenching at his sides before he exhaled sharply. "Forgive my intrusion, but I believe you may be the only person who can help me." She stepped aside, allowing him entry without a word. The fire in the hearth had burned low, but it still offered warmth, and he sank into the chair opposite hers, his posture rigid, as if bracing for impact. Without asking, she poured him a cup of tea and set it before him. His fingers wrapped around the porcelain, though he did not drink. "You've read the paper," he said at last. "Then you know about my brother." "Yes," she replied simply. He let out a slow, uneven breath. "They're calling it an accident." "They are," she agreed. "But you do not believe it." His gaze snapped to hers, startled, though he should not have been. If he had come to her, he had already suspected as much himself. He hesitated only a moment before shaking his head. "No, and neither did Samuel. He told me," he broke off, jaw tightening, then tried again. "Before the crash he confided in me. Said something wasn't right. Corners were being cut, safety protocols ignored. But more than that," his voice lowered, "he believed someone was interfering." The room seemed to shrink around them, the crackle of the fire the only sound between them for a long moment. Miss Hayes studied him with eyes that missed nothing, noting the flicker of unease beneath his grief. "Did he name anyone?" she asked finally. Julian swallowed, fingers tightening around the teacup, not in so many words. But he mentioned one name more than once. Victor Ashcombe. The name was unfamiliar, but the way it was spoken carried weight. The executive overseeing the project, she prompted. Julian nodded. Samuel said Ashcombe was too eager to prove something, too willing to take risks. And now, his voice faltered, now my brother is dead, and the company will move on as though he never mattered. Miss Hayes did not speak immediately, allowing the weight of his words to settle. Then with deliberate care, she reached for the newspaper beside her chair, smoothing open the creased page. And yet, she murmured, some things refuse to stay buried. She traced the photograph with a gloved fingertip, as if searching for the ghost of something overlooked. Then after a moment, she looked back up at Julian Hargrove, her expression unreadable. Tell me, Mr. Hargrove, do you truly wish to know what happened to your brother? Because once truth is unraveled, it cannot be rewoven. He met her gaze, something hard and resolute in his own. I need to know. A faint smile touched her lips, not one of amusement, but of understanding. Then we shall begin. The leather-bound notebook lay between them, unremarkable at first glance, its edges softened by years of use, its spine creased where it had been folded open too many times. But Evelyn Carrington knew better than to judge a book by its cover. Secrets did not announce themselves, they whispered from the margins, hidden in ink and implication. She ran a gloved fingertip along the cover before opening it, flipping through pages dense with precise mechanical sketches, notes written in a firm, deliberate hand. Then near the very end, she found the last entry. The balance is off, the numbers do not lie. If they push any further, it will collapse. The words were underlined twice, the final line smudged as if the writer had hesitated, or been interrupted. Across the table, Daniel Graves leaned forward, his face pale, his hands trembling where they rested on his knees. Miss Carrington, he said, his voice hoarse. They're calling it a miscalculation, an unfortunate mistake, but this, he gestured to the book, his breath hitching, this is proof. Edgar knew, he tried to warn them. Evelyn did not look up immediately, turning the book over in her hands, weighing it, not its physical mass, but what it contained. You believe your brother was silenced? She asked at last, her voice measured. Daniel swallowed, looking away. I don't know, he admitted. But Edgar never made mistakes, not like this. He was meticulous, obsessive even. If something was wrong, he would have found it. He would have told me. A muscle in his jaw tightened. And now he's dead. Evelyn studied him, noting the way grief sat on him like an ill-fitting coat, heavy, suffocating. But there was more than sorrow in his eyes. Fear lurked beneath it, sharp and restless. He was not only mourning, he was terrified. Tell me about the project, she said. The Sentinel Initiative, Daniel answered, exhaling sharply, a breakthrough in structural engineering, or so they claimed. A suspension bridge unlike anything ever attempted before, faster, cheaper, stronger, that's what they promised. His lips twisted, except Edgar was worried, said they were pushing the design beyond its limits, sacrificing safety for spectacle. They wanted records broken, headlines made, and now, his voice cracked, now it's collapsed, and he's gone. Evelyn tapped a gloved finger against the open book, considering, was there anyone in particular he distrusted? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. Elliot Varner, he said. The lead investor, he had too much riding on the success of the project. Edgar told me, Varner wasn't just funding it, he was controlling it, changing things, overriding concerns. Edgar said if the project failed, it wouldn't just be an engineering disaster, it would be financial ruin. He dragged a hand through his hair, and then just before the collapse, he told me something felt wrong. He didn't say what, but I could hear it in his voice. He was afraid. Evelyn closed the notebook carefully, setting it aside. Mr. Graves, she said, meeting his gaze, what you are asking, This is not simply uncovering an error. If what your brother suspected is true, then this is something far more deliberate. I don't care, Daniel said fiercely. I need to know. A small knowing smile touched her lips. Then we begin. The cold wind carried an eerie stillness through the empty train platform as Eleanor Graves stepped onto the weathered wooden planks. The scene before her was steeped in silence, but it was not the peaceful kind. It was the hushed quiet that followed disaster, the kind that still bore the echoes of a tragedy too fresh to be forgotten. Just days ago, a newly designed locomotive had derailed here, a marvel of modern engineering, reduced to a heap of twisted steel and scorched iron. The scent of burnt metal still lingered in the air, clinging stubbornly to the ruins of progress. Eleanor pulled her coat tighter around her shoulders, her gloved fingers brushing against the small leather-bound diary tucked securely in her pocket. It had belonged to Harvey Langley, the lead engineer on the ill-fated project. His final entry was brief, almost cryptic. Speed is the illusion of control, the truth lies in the momentum. A warning, or the final confession of a man who had seen the inevitable coming, that she intended to find out. Inspector Hale stood nearby, his aging but sharp eyes scanning the desolate platform with the weary suspicion of a man who had seen too many cases swept under bureaucratic rugs. He adjusted his hat, nodding toward Eleanor as she approached. "Strange business, Miss Graves," he muttered. "The people connected to this project, they either vanish before they can speak, or end up buried before they get the chance." Eleanor met his gaze, the words settling uneasily in the back of her mind. A pattern was emerging, one that smelled of more than just an accident. She glanced down at the journal in her hand, flipping through its pages. The scribbled notes detailed concerns about faulty calculations, rushed testing, and crucial safety measures being ignored in favor of achieving record-breaking speeds. But one phrase stood out among the technical jargon, a simple but chilling line. They knew, and they did it anyway. Her steps slowed as she approached the wreckage site, where remnants of the once grand machine lay abandoned. The tracks bore the scars of the disaster, metal rails warped from the heat and impact. She exhaled slowly, her breath visible in the crisp air, but just as she was about to kneel for a closer look, a sensation prickled at the back of her neck. She was being watched. The signs were subtle but unmistakable. A faint shift in the shadows beyond the platform, the lingering scent of cigarette smoke despite no one nearby, and fresh footprints in the dirt, leading away rather than toward her. Someone had been here moments before her arrival, someone who didn't want to be seen. Miss Graves. Hale's voice cut through her thoughts, drawing her attention back to him. Whoever is behind this, they won't stop until they've buried every loose end. And that includes anyone asking the wrong questions. Eleanor looked past him toward the remnants of the derailed train. The gears that had slipped, the brakes that had failed, the test that had been pushed through despite repeated warnings. A corporation desperate to stay ahead of the competition, an engineer who had realized too late that safety was being sacrificed for speed, and now, secrets buried beneath a convenient tragedy. From somewhere in the distance, the mournful wail of a train whistle echoed through the valley, carried on the wind like a ghostly reminder of what had been lost. But Eleanor knew one thing for certain: this was no accident. This was a murder designed to look like progress, and she intended to prove it before the next train met the same fate. The funeral had ended, but the weight of unspoken truths clung to the air like fog rolling in before a storm. Eleanor Graves remained at the cemetery's edge, standing beneath the boughs of a skeletal yew tree, its gnarled branches arching like claws against the overcast sky. She was dressed in a charcoal grey coat, tailored to perfection, the hem just brushing against the damp earth. The scent of old books and wet wool lingered around her, a scholar's fragrance, one of knowledge and quiet patience. Her sharp gaze cut through the crowd, not seeking the grieving brother or the murmured condolences whispered over fresh soil, but honing in on the figure that had no business being here. Victoria Langley. She was poised just beyond the mourners, watching without appearing to watch, her presence calculated down to the inch. Victoria was not a woman accustomed to funerals for men who worked with grease-stained hands and blueprints inked with risk. Her world was one of polished boardroom tables and decisions made with a flick of a pen, not one of dirt and grief. Yet here she was, wrapped in a navy wool coat cinched at the waist, her hat tilted just enough to conceal the sharpness in her gaze. Eleanor saw the way she held herself, too composed, too careful, every breath measured, every glance intentional. Eleanor adjusted her gloves, a practiced movement that allowed her to lean toward Albert Thorne without drawing attention. "You said your brother had concerns, didn't you?" Her voice was soft, deceptively light, but there was steel beneath it. Albert's jaw tensed, his shoulders stiffening as he stared at the grave. "He told me not to trust them," he muttered, his voice thick with something that wavered between grief and guilt. "Said they were pushing too hard, testing speeds beyond what was safe, ignoring the risks." His hands clenched into fists at his sides. "I told him to walk away." His voice dropped lower. "He said it wasn't that simple." Eleanor followed his gaze, then let hers drift back to Victoria Langley, who was surveying the scene with the precision of someone calculating risk, gauging what could be learned from a distance. At the edge of the churchyard, her stance was not one of mourning, but of control. This was not a woman overcome with grief. This was a woman ensuring that whatever had been buried today, stayed buried. Eleanor tilted her head slightly, and Miss Langley, Albert exhaled sharply, a bitter laugh escaping him. She was the one who convinced him to go through with the test. Said the company was on the brink of something revolutionary, that safety measures were for those who lacked ambition. His eyes darkened. MRC's golden girl, brilliant, ruthless, untouchable. Eleanor's lips curved slightly, though there was no humor in it. "Then what brings her here?" Albert didn't answer. He didn't need to. Across the churchyard, Victoria Langley cast one last look at the grave before turning, her heels clicking softly against the damp stone as she disappeared into the mist-draped afternoon. Eleanor had seen exits like that before, not a retreat, a tactical withdrawal. Adjusting the clasp of her handbag with deliberate care, she turned to Albert. "I need to get inside MRC." He looked at her sharply. "That's not going to be easy." She met his gaze evenly. "Nothing worth knowing ever is." The rain began moments later, slow at first, then steady, a rhythmic tapping against the windows of Eleanor's study, marking time like the steady ticking of a metronome. Outside, the town of Ashcombe was swallowed in mist, the cobblestone streets slick with rain, rooftops hunched beneath a shroud of grey. It was the kind of afternoon that kept people indoors, their fires stoked high, their doors shut tight against the cold. But Eleanor had never been one for comfort. Seated in her high-backed chair, she reached for the telephone, her fingers moving with practiced precision as she dialed a number she hadn't called in years. The line crackled once, twice before a clipped voice answered. "The Bradshaw residence." "Miss Eleanor Graves for Miss Lucy Bradshaw," she said, her voice pleasant but firm enough to demand action. A pause, the faint murmur of conversation in the background, then a more familiar voice, smooth, with an edge of curiosity. "Eleanor, my dear, what a surprise." "Lucy," Eleanor murmured, settling deeper into her chair, the glow of the fire casting shifting shadows across the room. "I do hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all," Lucy replied, her voice warm but sharpened with interest. "The weather is keeping all the interesting people indoors. I find myself in rather dull company." Eleanor allowed herself a small smile. "Perhaps I can offer you something more engaging." There was a brief pause, a momentary stillness on the other end of the line. Then Lucy's voice, light but deliberate. "Oh? And what exactly would that be?" Eleanor glanced at the newspaper folded neatly beside her, the bold black print of yesterday's headline peering up at her like an unspoken challenge. "Tell me, Lucy," she said softly, fingers brushing absently against the knitted wool in her lap. "What do you know about the modern rail corporation?" Silence. Not long, just enough. Then a practiced laugh, light, but calculated. "Eleanor, my dear," Lucy said, amusement curling through her words. "What a peculiar question." Eleanor Graves pressed the telephone receiver gently to her ear, her gaze drifting past the rain-speckled window, where the silver glow of the streetlights stretched across the empty London streets like ghostly fingers. But her attention wasn't on the cityscape. It was fixed on the shadowy figure standing beneath a lamppost, unmoving, almost watchful, a presence just on the edge of her awareness. A voice on the other end of the line finally spoke, smooth yet weighted with something unspoken. "Eleanor, I thought you only concerned yourself with village affairs. Trains now, how very modern of you." A hint of amusement touched Eleanor's lips, though her fingers coiled instinctively around the phone cord, an unconscious habit, one she had never quite broken. "Times change, Lucy," she said lightly, "and so do the questions worth asking. I find myself in need of a small favor." A pause, then Lucy's voice returned, laced with curiosity. "I can't imagine what sort of favor I could possibly provide where railroads are concerned." But the way she said it suggested she could in fact imagine it. Eleanor leaned back slightly, adjusting the cuff of her glove with a deliberate patience. "I need a way in." A soft exhalation followed by the distant rustle of papers, then a chuckle, half amused, half skeptical. "Jane dear, what on earth do you want with the modern rail corporation? They're hardly the sort to welcome part-time staff." Eleanor allowed a touch of innocence to creep into her voice. "Oh, I'm sure we can come up with some arrangement. I simply need an opportunity." A longer pause this time, stretching between them like a held breath. Then Lucy sighed. "You always did have a way of making a request sound like a fait accompli," she murmured. Eleanor smiled. "Oh, Lucy, I do hope I haven't lost my touch." There was another soft laugh on the other end of the line, and then resigned but intrigued, Lucy spoke again. "There is a position, temporary, insignificant. A records assistant, filing, paperwork, nothing thrilling, but it's inside their London office." Eleanor's grip on the phone cord tightened ever so slightly. "And would it be terribly difficult," she said, voice laced with quiet persuasion, "to ensure that position finds its way to an interested party?" Lucy gave another soft chuckle. "For most people, perhaps. But for you, Jane, consider it done." A flicker of satisfaction crossed Eleanor's face. "Lucy, you are a marvel." "Yes, I am," Lucy said dryly. "And now you owe me a very long lunch the next time you're in London." Eleanor's smile deepened. "It would be my absolute pleasure." As she placed the receiver back in its cradle, she turned her gaze once more toward the rain-speckled glass. Outside, the sky stretched in an unbroken sheet of grey, thick and oppressive. The city was blurred at the edges, caught in a restless stillness before the inevitable. A storm was coming, and she had just secured herself a front-row seat. Lucy Bradshaw's office was the kind of place where important decisions were made, not with grand gestures but over neatly typed memos and stiff drinks after hours. The faint scent of lavender polish and aged ink lingered in the air, mixing with the warm, well-worn leather of high-backed chairs. The furniture, mahogany desk, precision-aligned papers reflected the mind of a woman who preferred order over sentiment. A small clock on the mantel ticked softly, its rhythmic pulse the only sound in the room as Lucy studied Eleanor with the sharp gaze of a woman who had seen too much to be easily surprised. "You've always had a way of keeping me on my toes," Lucy said, steepling her fingers. "And I can't say I dislike it. But this," she tapped a neatly folded paper on her desk. "This is a rather curious request." Eleanor sat across from her with the poised ease of a woman who had never asked for anything she wasn't prepared to earn. She merely adjusted the cuff of her glove, her expression betraying nothing. "Curious perhaps," she admitted. "Necessary, certainly." Lucy arched a perfectly sculpted eyebrow and unfolded the paper. A records assistant, she murmured. Temporary, dull, not quite the sort of thing that usually draws your interest. Eleanor's smile was pleasant, almost mild, until you looked closer. I do find administrative work rather soothing. Lucy snorted softly, then leaned forward, resting her elbows on the desk. Jane, let's not pretend I don't know you better than that. You're up to something. Eleanor tilted her chin slightly, her voice unwavering. Lucy dear, let's not pretend you aren't already intrigued. Lucy's lips twitched, but she didn't argue. Instead she picked up the paper again, turning it between her fingers. The Modern Rail Corporation, she mused. I assume this has something to do with that ghastly accident. Eleanor neither confirmed nor denied. Instead she pulled off her glove, smoothing the fabric carefully before looking up. I would be ever so grateful, Lucy. Confidentiality is paramount. You understand, Lucy sighed, a slow knowing breath, but there was amusement in it. Of course I understand, but you'd better not get yourself sacked in the first week. Eleanor's smile was unriddable. I shall do my best to be the very model of efficiency. Lucy reached for a pen, signing a note with a few swift strokes before sliding it across the desk. Take this to MRC's employment office. It's a personal recommendation, which means they won't ask too many questions. Eleanor folded the note neatly, tucking it into her handbag. I assume you have a cover story prepared. A faint smirk played on her lips as she stood. Oh yes, she murmured. A widow with nothing but time, and a fondness for order. They won't suspect a thing. Lucy shook her head, watching her with something between admiration and mild exasperation. Try not to burn the place down, will you? Eleanor only smiled, slow knowing, filled with a quiet certainty. Outside, the storm clouds thickened, and in the distance the first rumbles of thunder whispered their arrival. She had just stepped into dangerous territory, and that was exactly where she wanted to be. Miss Eleanor Graves adjusted her gloves as she stepped into the grand, gleaming atrium of the Blackthorn Industrial Consortium, a name that whispered through business circles with the quiet weight of power. The London morning was damp with fading rain, the streets still slick, and the air held the lingering chill of something not quite ready to be forgotten. She had been here before, not physically, but in spirit, in whispered rumors and ink-stained contracts that told stories more damning than any confession. But today, she was no longer an observer. Today, she was Margaret Whitmore, a mild-mannered, unobtrusive widow supplementing her pension with honest work, precisely the sort of person who faded into the background, or at least, that's what she wanted them to believe. Her shoes tapped softly against the polished marble floor as she approached the security desk, where a young man barely out of university flipped through a register with mechanical precision. Name? He asked without looking up. Margaret Whitmore, she replied, her voice laced with just the right amount of meekness. He found her name, nodded, and slid a temporary identification badge across the counter. Records Department, 6th floor, Miss Redgrave will be expecting you. Eleanor pinned the badge to her coat, offering the young man a small, pleasant smile. You're terribly efficient. He blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the unexpected kindness, then straightened his posture. Thank you, ma'am. The lift doors gleamed before her as she stepped inside, smoothing the fabric of her modest grey skirt. The first rule of going unnoticed was to behave precisely as expected. A nervous woman would attract attention, a woman too assured would raise questions. But a quiet, polite widow looking for work, no one ever saw past that. The soft chime of the elevator punctuated her thoughts as she stepped onto the 6th floor, where a long corridor stretched before her, lined with frosted glass offices, and the quiet hum of industry. The scent of ink, warm paper, and polished wood filled the air, familiar and reassuring. A woman awaited her, Evelyn Redgrave, tall and composed, her dark hair pulled into a severe chignon, the type of woman who knew how to run things while men took the credit. Her sharp gaze took in Eleanor at a glance, filing her away with practiced efficiency. "Mrs. Whitmore?" she asked, her voice carrying the cool precision of someone who had no patience for mistakes. Eleanor offered a warm smile, extending a gloved hand. "Yes, dear. I do hope I won't get lost in these long corridors." Evelyn shook her hand firmly, her lips curving just slightly at the edges. "Oh, we all do at first. But I suspect you'll find your way soon enough." As she led Eleanor down the hall, her heels tapping in even rhythm, the older woman allowed herself a quiet, knowing glance around. The Blackthorn Consortium was no ordinary company. Fortunes were made here, and lives were quietly undone. Whispers didn't pass over garden fences. They were sealed behind steel doors, written in fine print, buried in ledgers only a careful eye would notice. The records department was tucked away at the end of the hall, a windowless room of meticulous order, filled with cabinets that held secrets far older than the ink that marked them. As Evelyn handed Eleanor a file, she hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, her gaze unreadable. "We keep things organized here, Mrs. Whitmore," she said carefully. "Discretion is expected." Eleanor met her gaze, mild and unassuming. "Oh, I quite understand. I find quiet places tend to yield the most interesting discoveries." A flicker of something crossed Evelyn's face. Awareness, suspicion perhaps. Then just as quickly it was gone. "Well," she said smoothly, stepping back, "let's get you settled in, shall we?" As Eleanor took her place at her new desk, she let her fingers trail over the smooth surface, her expression betraying nothing. She had unraveled many mysteries before, but this was something new. The stage was set, the game had begun, and she was ready to see who would make the first move. The scent of aged paper and ink clung to the air like a whisper of the past. The records room a quiet sanctuary of bureaucracy, where secrets were tucked between ledgers and reports, hidden in the spaces no one thought to examine. Eleanor Graves, known here as Margaret Whitmore, settled into her seat, gloved hands smoothing the surface of the desk as she arranged the stack of files before her. The typewriter sat idle, a silent sentinel to the countless words committed to history in neat mechanical strokes. The low hum of ventilation masked the occasional murmur of conversation drifting in from the corridor, a ticking clock marking the slow march of time in a place where change came only on paper. It was here, beneath the weight of routine, that the truth often lay buried. She flipped open a file, not truly reading but absorbing, dates, figures, names. A pattern would emerge, it always did. Then footsteps, two men walking past her door, their voices hushed but urgent. "We can't afford another setback," one of them muttered, his words clipped with frustration. "If the numbers don't align, it won't just be our jobs on the line." The second voice, lower, edged with something sharper, fear perhaps. "Then make them align. You saw what happened to Hawthorne, no mistakes this time." A pause, then the shuffle of hurried steps as they moved on, their words leaving a ripple in the otherwise still air. Eleanor's fingers hovered over a page, her mind cataloguing each syllable. She knew the name Hawthorne, a financial analyst, rumored to have uncovered discrepancies in the company's ledgers. An unfortunate accident, they said. A slip from a platform, a train that did not stop in time, but accidents were rarely so convenient. She retrieved a small leather notebook from her handbag, the pages already lined with careful notations, observations that others might dismiss. Hawthorne. Discrepancies, adjusting numbers. No mistakes this time. The implications were clear. Someone was correcting something, something that should never have been discovered in the first place. The company cafeteria was a study in quiet efficiency, a space designed for function rather than comfort. Business was conducted between bites, conversations measured, polite, and always cautious. Eleanor stood in line, her expression one of mild curiosity as she studied the menu without truly seeing it, her attention elsewhere. She observed through reflections the polished glass of the food display, the gleaming surface of a silver serving tray. That was how she noticed Marianne de Béraud enter. She did not simply arrive, she commanded the room with an effortless grace, her tailored emerald dress a striking contrast to the muted tones of corporate wear around her. A woman who knew the power of presence, of silence, of measured words spoken at the right moment. She moved toward a table in the corner, where a man already sat, his shoulders tense beneath the fabric of his charcoal suit. Not a subordinate, a partner, a co-conspirator. Eleanor edged closer, her posture unchanged, her ears finely attuned to the undercurrent of tension woven into their words. "The auditors will be here by next week," Marianne murmured, lifting her coffee cup with deliberate ease. "We need a resolution before then." The man stirred his tea, his grip tightening ever so slightly on the spoon. "Hawthorne was meant to be the last. If there are others, there are always others," Marianne interrupted smoothly, her gaze unwavering. "The problem is making sure they understand the cost of curiosity." A silence stretched between them, heavy with unsaid warnings. Eleanor reached for a scone she had no intention of eating, tilting her head just slightly, just enough to catch Marianne's reflection in the glass surface of the counter, composed, certain, dangerous. The kind of woman who did not issue threats, only promises. A game was unfolding, one played in shadows and whispers, in ledgers and last words. Eleanor had seen its kind before, but never like this. Never in a place where power was signed into existence with the stroke of a pen, where life and ruin were dictated by numbers on a page. She lifted her teacup to her lips, her expression unreadable, her pulse steady. The stage was set, and the first move had just been made. The records office breathed a silence unlike any other part of the company, a silence not of emptiness, but of waiting. A hush filled with the weight of history, the rustle of paper whispering secrets no one had yet uncovered. Eleanor Graves, known to those around her as Margaret Whitmore, sat at her desk, fingers poised over a stack of requisition forms, her expression one of quiet diligence. She played the part well. To her colleagues, she was nothing more than a meticulous clerk, the kind of woman who took comfort in the predictability of paperwork, a creature of routine, but that was a carefully curated illusion. Her true focus lay elsewhere. Across the room, a single cabinet stood, its drawer labeled in sharp, block letters, "Test Run, Confidential." It had been there for weeks, an unassuming fixture in a room full of routine reports and mundane bureaucracy. But Eleanor had learned long ago that danger rarely announced itself with fanfare. It lurked in plain sight, waiting for the right eyes to see. She had spent years honing her instincts, learning to recognize the scent of something rotten beneath polished surfaces. This file, sitting quietly among the ordinary, set off every warning in her mind. She cast a glance toward the open doorway. Empty. The hum of distant conversations had faded with the exodus of employees heading home, leaving behind the soft ticking of the wall clock and the occasional creak of settling furniture. With practiced ease, she pushed back her chair, her movements unhurried, deliberate. To an observer she was merely tidying up, adjusting the alignment of folders, perhaps shifting her workspace into a more orderly arrangement. But her hand, steady and sure, reached for the cabinet handle. Of course. A small smile touched her lips. Expected, but inconvenient. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." The voice was soft, smooth as velvet, but edged with warning. Eleanor turned, unfazed, to find Vivienne Calloway leaning against a nearby filing cabinet, arms folded, one brow arched in mild amusement. Vivienne was the kind of woman who never raised her voice, never made a scene, because she never needed to. She had mastered the art of looking at ease while always being 5 steps ahead. Eleanor adjusted her spectacles, offering a small polite smile. "Oh dear," she said, The very picture of genteel innocence. Have I been caught? Vivienne pushed off the cabinet, her heels clicking softly as she stepped closer. That depends, she murmured. Are you just a curious clerk, or are you looking for something you're not supposed to find? Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if considering the question. I do find curiosity rather underrated, don't you? Vivienne studied her for a long moment, then sighed. A flicker of something hesitation perhaps crossed her face before she reached into her pocket. A glint of metal. A key. I never believed the official story either, she murmured, slipping the key into the lock with practiced ease. A quiet click, and the drawer slid open. Vivienne reached inside, fingers dancing over folders before selecting one, thick, heavy, weighed down with something more than paper. She set it on the desk and hesitated, her gaze flicking to Eleanor. I've seen the purchase orders, she whispered. The deadlines, the impossible figures, something doesn't add up. Eleanor's fingers grazed the folder's edge before she opened it, scanning the crisp pages, component requests from unnamed suppliers. Bulk orders with no clear destination, official documents, but they felt wrong. The ink almost hummed with deception. She turned a page, and another. The sums were staggering, the dates too rushed. Her breath left her in a slow, measured exhale. We mustn't jump to conclusions, she murmured. But this is quite telling. Vivienne's jaw tightened. If it's what I think it is, we're not the only ones looking. Outside the silence had changed. It was no longer the stillness of routine but something else. A watchful quiet, the kind that meant someone or something was lurking just beyond the edges of perception. The corridors of Novus Rail were never meant to be empty. By day they pulsed with movement, the constant energy of engineers, executives and analysts, all working toward progress, efficiency, power. But now, in the late hours of the night, they felt different, hollow, expectant. The overhead lights flickered faintly, their steady buzz like a whisper in the dark. This was a place built for function, not comfort. Sleek steel railings, concrete walls, no windows, no easy exits. A labyrinth designed to keep things in. Eleanor moved carefully, her soft-soled shoes making no sound against the polished floor. She did not belong here, but she walked as though she did. The engineering archives lay ahead, a steel door guarded only by a keycard scanner. No grand security, no armed personnel, just a panel waiting for the right credentials. The borrowed keycard in her gloved hand was warm. Vivienne's last contribution before slipping away into the shadows. She swiped it. A pause, a single heartbeat, then a soft beep. The light flickered green. The lock released. Eleanor exhaled slowly, pressing her gloved fingers against the cool steel of the door. Inside lay answers. Answers no one wanted found. She stepped forward, disappearing into the dark, and behind her, somewhere deep in the silent corridors of Novus Rail, a faint red light blinked to life. She was no longer alone. The steel door yielded without resistance. A quiet click echoing into the vastness beyond. She stepped inside. The room stretched out before her, an expanse of industrial precision, exposed beams laced with the sharp scent of machine oil, long drafting tables arranged in rigid symmetry, their surfaces littered with schematics and blueprints. The hum of unseen machinery pulsed faintly beneath the floor, a mechanical heartbeat that never quite stopped. This was the nerve center, the hidden core where concepts turned into something more, something dangerous. Her gaze flicked across the walls where pinned diagrams and dense calculations wove a story meant for the privileged few. There near the far end of the room, a blueprint, unlike the rest, its edges were curled as if it had been handled too often, the ink slightly smudged, the corners stained with something dark, not quite oil. She stepped closer, her gloved fingers tracing its margins, notes scrawled in red ink, urgent, erratic, almost frantic. Structural integrity compromised at high velocity. A chill ran through her. The flaw was known, and yet the project had continued. Someone had buried the warning beneath layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. A movement, barely there, but enough. A ripple in the silence beyond the doorway, not the idle shuffle of a janitor or the aimless drift of an engineer returning for a forgotten file. No, this was measured, deliberate. A presence. She moved swiftly, folding the blueprint and tucking it into the lining of her coat. The footsteps slowed, then stopped. A voice, low and controlled, carried through the still air. "She's looking too closely." A pause, then a sharper edge to the tone. No mistakes this time. A slow exhale. So they already knew. She pressed herself into the shadows, her heartbeat steady but quick. The door shifted open just a fraction. A silhouette, lingering, waiting, watching. Seconds stretched, then the figure retreated, footsteps fading into the corridor beyond. Only when silence returned did she move again. This wasn't just about information anymore. This was about survival. She straightened, adjusted her coat, and stepped toward the exit. Not rushed, not hesitant. A woman with purpose, walking a path only she knew. But the air had changed. The quiet was no longer empty. It was filled with waiting eyes, unseen but felt. And somewhere in the distance, past the hum of generators and the metallic scent of secrets long buried, the game was already in motion. The office door shut with quiet finality, the kind of closure that didn't just keep sound out but locked secrets in. Miss Hargrove stood still, her gaze level as Griffiths settled behind his desk. The room was neat, too neat. Stacks of blueprints, a drafting board wiped meticulously clean, yet the scent of oil and ink still clung to the air like an unspoken warning. He steepled his fingers, watching her with the practiced patience of a man who knew more than he was willing to admit. "You have questions," he said at last. She allowed herself the smallest of smiles, an expression devoid of amusement, only the kind worth asking. Griffiths exhaled, a careful thing, as if measuring the weight of his next words. Outside, the hum of industry continued, a distant murmur of machines, voices, lives entangled in something far larger than themselves. Yet within these four walls, the air had changed. She adjusted her spectacles, a meaningless gesture to most. To her a quiet reminder. This was the moment where a conversation turned into something else. Not far from here, past the rows of sterile offices and the gleaming machines that had built a reputation on efficiency, a cafe stood at the corner of a narrow street, the kind of place where conversations sank between the hiss of steam and the clink of porcelain. The morning rush had dissipated, leaving behind only the scent of roasted coffee and the quiet hum of those with nowhere urgent to be. Miss Hargrove sat by the window, a cup of untouched tea before her. The golden light cut across the checkered floor, casting long streaks over her gloved hands. She had chosen her seat deliberately, a view of the entrance, a position where no one could approach unnoticed. 5 minutes late, Albert Blackwood stepped inside, a man who looked as though he had spent his morning glancing over his shoulder. His coat was buttoned too high, his hat pulled too low, his fingers twitching as he slid into the chair across from her. "Miss Hargrove, Mr. Blackwood." No pleasantries. He fumbled briefly, then withdrew a battered leather notebook from his coat. He placed it between them, a confession without words. She reached for it. The leather was worn, softened by time and use. She opened it with careful hands, the pages filled with meticulous notes, calculations, sketches, data recorded in precise script. But as she turned the pages, something shifted. The handwriting grew erratic, the ink smudged, the words more frantic. Albert leaned in. "They knew," he whispered. He knew. She read the words scrawled along the margins, her pulse steady but quickening, structural integrity compromised, unstable at high speeds, not tested, not safe, a slow exhale. This was no accident. She turned another page. The words slashed across it in hurried desperation. They want it to fail. Her fingers tightened on the paper. Not about speed, not about progress. A spectacle, a disaster, a calculated catastrophe. Albert's voice was tight, a staged failure. For money, for power. She pressed her lips together. People had already died, and now the truth lay in her hands, a truth someone had been willing to kill for. The weight of it settled between them, heavy as the silence that followed. Albert's hands curled into fists. What do we do? She lifted her cup, took a single sip. The tea had gone cold. She set it down with quiet precision, then she met his gaze. We finish what he started. Outside, the city moved on, unaware, indifferent. But in the quiet hum of a forgotten cafe, the tide had already begun to turn. The cafe was behind her now, its whispered secrets dissolving into the restless heartbeat of the city. Eleanor Graves stepped into the brisk morning, her mind already turning the pieces over. The hum of London had returned in full force, newsboys shouting headlines, trolley cars rattling along the rails, the clipped heels of men in tailored suits weaving through the churn of daily commerce. But Eleanor had always preferred places where time moved a little slower. She crossed the street, settling onto a worn bench beneath the vast arms of an ancient chestnut tree. The scent of damp earth and fallen leaves clung to the crisp air, a quiet contrast to the turmoil threading through her thoughts. Across from her, James Holloway lingered at the edge of the path, his fingers restless against the brim of his hat. He wasn't a man accustomed to waiting, and certainly not when the stakes were this high. "We have enough," he said at last, his voice low taut. "The ledgers, the signatures, they prove it all. We go to the authorities now, and they'll have no choice but to act." Eleanor lifted a gloved hand, the motion so slight yet precise enough to silence him. A pair of well-dressed women passed, their laughter featherlight, their conversation a meaningless thread of social affairs and evening invitations. They were too close. Too many ears, too many variables. Only when their voices faded into the city's din did Eleanor speak, her tone measured, deliberate. "The truth must be built on stone, Mr. Holloway, not sand." James exhaled sharply, frustration threading his voice. "How much more certain do we need to be? My brother, he knew, he saw it, and they killed him for it." His words wavered, but his resolve did not. "You think if we wait, it'll stop them?" Eleanor turned to him then, her gaze cool beneath the gleam of gold-rimmed spectacles. "I think if we act before we're ready, we become their next problem to solve." James studied her, really studied her, and something in his expression shifted. He had underestimated her. "They all did. They'll come after you," he murmured, quieter now, realization sinking in. Eleanor's lips curved, not in amusement, but in understanding. That would be a miscalculation on their part. A distant trolley bell echoed through the streets, the breeze stirring the hem of her coat as she rose, gripping the handle of her handbag with quiet finality. "We still have work to do." She turned, walking back toward the heart of the city, toward Holloway Industries, the empire of polished ambition and hidden knives. James remained on the bench staring after her. The wind had shifted, a storm was coming, and Eleanor Graves was walking straight into it. The records office was a tomb of forgotten decisions, the air thick with the stale scent of paper and ink. Fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting sharp-edged shadows against rows of filing cabinets, neat, organized, deceptively unassuming. It was late, too late for anyone but the desperate or the dangerously determined. Victoria Langley stood near the desk, breath shallow, hands clenched around a single sheet of paper like it might catch fire in her grip. Her sharp brown eyes darted to Eleanor, searching, weighing. "I saw it," she whispered, her voice barely louder than the hum of the flickering bulbs. She tapped the memo once, a sharp, nervous gesture. "They didn't want an inspection. It's right here." Eleanor stepped forward, her gloved hand closing around the paper with quiet precision. The words were deceptively simple, yet laden with intent. Special bonus for accelerated results. Ensure no mechanical inspection occurs before the test run. Her grip tightened. A reward for recklessness, a deliberate omission, not incompetence, intent. Victoria swallowed hard. He knew. Her voice trembled, realization settling like ice. Your source, he saw something. Maybe a change in the pressure valves. Maybe a modification to the braking system. But he knew. Eleanor's gaze remained on the paper. The ink had dried, but the intent behind it was still fresh. They had made a calculation, that no one would look too closely, that no one would be left to speak. They were wrong. The memo was innocuous at first glance, crisp, professional, the kind of corporate shorthand meant to breeze past a casual eye. But Eleanor Graves was no casual eye. She studied the words, her gaze unmoving, her mind threading the implications together with quiet precision. They had never intended for the test to be safe. They had ensured it would fail. Across the desk, Victoria Langley let out a slow breath, her fingers clenching the edge of a nearby folder. This means people knew, executives, engineers, maybe even the board. They didn't just let it happen. They orchestrated it. Eleanor's gloved fingers smoothed the paper against the desk, her expression unreadable. The question is why? Victoria hesitated, then nodded toward a filing cabinet behind the desk. If there's more, it'll be there. Eleanor barely glanced at it. Instead, she looked toward the door, her instincts sharpening. The silence had changed. It was the same sensation she had felt countless times before, a whisper at the back of the mind, a shift in the air, a warning. She set the memo down, aligning it carefully, making sure it looked untouched. Not tonight. Victoria blinked. But they already suspect me. Eleanor's voice was calm, certain. If they suspect you as well, we lose our last advantage. Victoria swallowed but nodded, her fingers moving in an attempt to look busy, to mask the thrum of unease settling into her bones. And if they catch on? Eleanor gave a small knowing smile. Then we shall be very clever instead. The hush of the records office deepened, stretching out beyond the door. The corridor outside was empty, but the silence no longer felt like solitude. It felt like something else, something waiting. The hallway stretched long and narrow beneath the harsh flicker of fluorescent lights, sterile walls gleaming faintly in their artificial glow. The evening shift had long since filtered out, leaving behind only the mechanical hum of unseen machinery, and the occasional echo of footsteps, measured, deliberate, not her own. Eleanor walked with quiet certainty, her handbag tucked neatly at her side, her posture composed. She had spent years perfecting the art of appearing precisely where she was meant to be, even when she wasn't. Then came the voice, Miss Graves. It was smooth, controlled, sliding into the space between them, with an ease that suggested power wielded carefully. Eleanor turned, and there stood Evelyn Marchant, poised, elegant, her presence calculated. The corridor lights sharpened the lines of her face, casting shadows beneath her sharp cheekbones, her dark navy dress a sheath of quiet authority. She smiled, thin, practiced. I do hope you're finding your work fulfilling, Miss Graves. We value loyalty here at Holloway Industries. Eleanor's hands remained folded over her handbag. Everyone has been most accommodating. Evelyn didn't blink. Good. We like our employees to feel at home. She stepped closer, her voice lowering by the smallest fraction. Of course that requires a certain level of trust, wouldn't you agree? Eleanor tilted her head slightly, as if considering. Trust is such a valuable thing. A measured silence. Eleanor could feel the weight of Marchant's gaze, the way she was being assessed, sized up like a chess piece in a game already underway. Faintest of leans. A near whisper, razor thin. Some people don't keep secrets well, Marchant murmured. They pay a high price for that. Eleanor's fingers brushed against the clasp of her handbag, A slow, deliberate movement. The message had been delivered. Marchant straightened, smoothing an invisible crease down the front of her dress. "Enjoy your evening, Miss Graves." And then she was gone, heels clicking softly as she disappeared down the corridor. Eleanor remained still, listening to the sound of retreating footsteps. Then, with quiet precision, she exhaled. The game had changed. If she kept digging, she might become the next accident. And yet, as she resumed her path, her pace remained steady, because now she was certain. She was very, very close. The archive was a graveyard of forgotten secrets, where dust and silence conspired to bury the past. Dim yellow lights flickered above, their uneven glow stretching long, uneasy shadows across the rows of metal cabinets. Eleanor Graves sat at a narrow wooden table, the kind designed for clerks who never asked too many questions. Across from her, Simon Hargrove paced with restless energy, his hands deep in his coat pockets, his jaw tight. He was a man who had seen too much, who knew the weight of buried truths. "They're erasing everything," Eleanor murmured, running her fingers over a file marked confidential. "Blueprints, maintenance records, anything that proves the train was doomed from the start." She exhaled, pressing her palm flat against the document as if she could anchor it to reality. "And if we wait too long, there won't be anything left." Hargrove stopped pacing, his eyes sharp with unease. "This isn't just about covering tracks. Someone is making sure the truth dies here." Eleanor met his gaze, her own steady. "Then we make sure it doesn't." She pulled a small flash drive from her pocket. "I've set an automatic backup. Every deleted file gets copied to an off-site server. But we need more than numbers." She glanced toward the workshop schematics pinned to the wall, a blueprint of deception laid bare. "We need something undeniable, something people will believe." Hargrove's expression darkened. "You mean evidence from the engineering lab?" Eleanor nodded. "Blueprints can be manipulated, but a rigged component, a sabotaged part, that's proof they can't erase." Silence hung between them for a moment, thick with risk. Then Hargrove let out a slow breath. "Getting in there isn't going to be easy." Eleanor gave a thin smile. "Nothing worth doing ever is." The engineering workshop was a labyrinth of steel and shadow. By day, it was alive with machinery and the controlled chaos of industry, but at night, it was something else entirely. The great unfinished train engines loomed like slumbering beasts, their hulking forms wrapped in darkness. Eleanor moved carefully between the rows of equipment, her footsteps featherlight on the cold concrete. The small camera in her gloved hands was steady as she lifted it. Click. The flash was brief, a white-hot flicker against the gloom. Click. She lowered the camera, inspecting the engine component in front of her. A metal plate, stamped with specifications, but something was wrong. The serial numbers had been altered, a thin layer of acid-worn metal barely disguising the truth. Someone had swapped the parts. The train had never been designed to survive. It had been designed to fail. A quiet breath escaped her. This was it. The proof. Then, a noise, a footstep. Eleanor turned, breath held tight in her chest. From the darkness, a figure emerged. Daniel Mercer. His coat was unbuttoned, sleeves rolled up, his face lined with exhaustion. A man who had already lost a battle he never wanted to fight. "You're not supposed to be here," he said quietly. Eleanor didn't move. "Neither are you." Mercer let out a hollow laugh. "And yet, here we are." He took a step closer, his expression unreadable. "You should walk away." Eleanor held his gaze. "I can't." The silence stretched. Then Mercer sighed, running a hand over his face. "Then you'd better be careful," he muttered, turning on his heel. A warning. A promise. And then he was gone, swallowed by the shadows once more. Eleanor exhaled slowly, pressing the circuit board deeper into her pocket. She had what she needed. But the game had changed. They weren't just covering up a failure. They were ensuring silence. And now, She knew one thing for certain: if she wasn't careful, she wouldn't make it out alive. A moment of silence settled over the cold workshop, the air thick with the weight of secrets too long buried. Then quietly, Harlan Whitaker exhaled, his voice hoarse with the burden of confession. "If you're looking for proof, you won't need much more than that." Evelyn Hale didn't move, didn't even blink. A lifetime spent unraveling deception had trained her to recognize when a man stood at the edge of his own ruin. Harlan's hands trembled as he raked his fingers through his hair. "They forced me into it," he muttered, his voice low but raw with truth. "The board, they knew I was drowning in debt. They gave me no choice. If I refused, they would have destroyed me." His breath hitched, but when he spoke again, it was quieter, emptier. "I never wanted anyone to die." Evelyn took a slow step forward, her voice firm yet careful. "Then help me stop it." For a moment doubt flickered across Harlan's face, but then with a shuddering breath, he reached into his coat pocket. His fingers, unsteady but resolved, produced a folded document, stained at the edges, worn from too many nights of hesitation. "This is everything," he whispered. Evelyn took the blueprint with careful hands, unfolding it beneath the dim workshop light. The annotations, the altered specifications, the deliberate mechanical failures, it was all there, undeniable, and damning. Her heart hammered with the weight of revelation. This wasn't negligence, it was sabotage, designed with chilling precision. Harlan rubbed his face, his voice nearly breaking. "They'll come after you." Evelyn tucked the blueprint into her bag, her lips curving into something that wasn't quite a smile. "Let them try." Then she turned, stepping into the night, knowing that the truth was a fire, and tonight it would burn through everything. The grand pavilion of Ashford Rail Systems was a cathedral of power, built on polished steel and polished lies. Chandeliers cast a cold, glittering light over the showroom, where a sleek model of the high-speed train stood displayed like a monument to progress. Investors circled in tailored suits, their conversations a hum of calculation and concealed ambition, while reporters lingered at the edges, their pens poised like weapons. At the heart of it all, standing beneath the spotlight with the practiced elegance of someone who had never known doubt, was Victoria Langford. She stepped onto the stage, her navy dress immaculate, her smile razor-sharp. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice carrying through the hush. "Tonight, we celebrate a new era in transportation," but beneath the grand spectacle, a storm had begun to unravel. Near the control booth, Daniel Grayson worked swiftly, his fingers dancing over the security system, ensuring the data Evelyn had retrieved was safely in place. In the audience, Sebastian Ward adjusted his cufflinks, masking the tension in his stance as he tightened his grip on the financial records, each page a nail in the coffin of a corporation built on deception. And Evelyn, she was not yet among them, not yet. A journalist furrowed his brow, scanning the room. "Where's Evelyn Hale?" he whispered. Another flash of cameras. Victoria Langford tilted her chin, basking in the moment, unaware that the foundation beneath her empire was beginning to crack. And then, "I think it's time we had a different perspective on innovation." The voice cut through the showroom with the quiet authority of someone who had already decided the ending to this story. Heads turned, whispers coiling through the air like the first stirrings of a storm. And at the foot of the stage, standing with calm precision, was Evelyn Hale. She was unassuming in her dark coat, her gloved hands resting neatly on her bag. Yet there was something in her stance, in the way she carried the weight of inevitable truth, that made the room still. Victoria's fingers curled around the microphone stand, her smile brittle, her eyes sharp with concealed fury. "I beg your pardon." Evelyn stepped forward, past the security men who hesitated just a second too long. "Innovation, Miss Langford, is built on progress, not on deception, not on murder." A murmur rippled through the crowd, a slow-building current of unease. Cameras flashed, pens scratched against notepads. A single breathless pause, and then the unraveling began. The blueprints, the financial records, the undeniable truth that could no longer be contained. Victoria Langford had spent years constructing a fortress of control, but she had forgotten one simple fact: the truth once set free could not be undone. A hush fell over the grand ballroom of the Belmont Hotel, its chandeliers casting fractured light across the sea of high society elites, gathered for the unveiling of Prescott Industries' latest marvel, a state-of-the-art security network promising impenetrability. At the podium, Sinclair Prescott, the company's indomitable CEO, stood with the poise of a man who had conquered the future itself. Cameras flashed, reporters murmured, and investors whispered their silent calculations. Then from the far end of the hall, the deliberate click of a single pair of heels disrupted the polished harmony. "Fascinating claims, Mr. Prescott." The voice cut through the murmur like a blade through silk, smooth, steady, dangerous. All heads turned. At the threshold stood a woman in an unassuming navy coat, her gloved hands neatly folded over a leather handbag. Eleanor Graves, former investigative journalist, current nightmare to the corrupt. The moment stretched taut as Prescott's fingers curled imperceptibly around the edges of the podium. "Miss Graves," he greeted, the faintest flicker of annoyance dancing across his otherwise unreadable features. "To what do we owe this unexpected visit?" Eleanor stepped forward, her movements deliberate, controlled, her eyes scanning the room with the quiet assurance of someone who already knew the answer to the question before it was asked. "I thought it prudent to provide a counterpoint to tonight's presentation," she said, her voice carrying the weight of an impending storm. She reached into her handbag, drawing out a single dossier. "Prescott Industries' security systems are indeed revolutionary," she continued, her gaze locked onto Sinclair's, "but not in the way you've led us to believe." She flipped open the file, revealing grainy surveillance stills, figures in dark suits exchanging briefcases, an encrypted email chain with timestamps that left little room for doubt. "This is proof," she said, her tone unwavering, "that your impenetrable security network was designed with backdoors, deliberate vulnerabilities that would allow you and those who paid you to control the very systems meant to protect." The tension in the room thickened, journalists scrambling to capture every word, every flicker of expression on Prescott's otherwise carefully controlled face. His lips pressed into a thin line. "This is preposterous," he said, voice clipped. But Eleanor was already moving, holding up another document, transaction records, payoffs, contracts buried under layers of deception, but now laid bare for all to see. A stir rippled through the audience, murmurs escalating into a roar. Then a new voice emerged, hesitant, shaken. "She's telling the truth." A man near the back stepped forward, his shoulders slumped under the weight of the secret he had carried too long. David Henshaw, former lead engineer on the project. The moment those words left his lips, it was as if the dam had burst. Cameras clicked in rapid succession. Prescott's grip on the podium tightened. He turned sharply, eyes like steel. "You spineless." But he never finished. The doors burst open, uniformed officers sweeping into the room with an efficiency that made it clear this was no mere interruption, it was the endgame. "Sinclair Prescott," an officer announced, voice firm, "you are under arrest for fraud, corporate espionage, and conspiracy to endanger national security." A tremor ran through the room, an empire unraveling before their eyes. Prescott's jaw clenched, his world crumbling in the span of minutes. He turned one last time, his gaze locking onto Eleanor's. For a fraction of a second, beneath the fury and the disbelief, there was something else, recognition, and then the handcuffs snapped shut. The world as he had built it collapsed. Eleanor watched, silent, as they led him away, his legacy reduced to nothing but ink on a criminal record. Then with the faintest nod, she turned on her heel, and walked into the night. There was always another truth waiting to be uncovered. The quiet hum of the train whispered through the countryside, its rhythmic churning against the rails a soothing counterpoint to the storm of thoughts in Nicholas Warrington's mind. For months, his brother had been nothing more than a name in a scandal, a fleeting tragedy buried beneath the weight of corporate deception. But tonight, the truth had shattered the illusion. He leaned against the window, watching the dim glow of the city recede into the ink-black distance, the echoes of the evening still fresh in his ears. Across from him, Olivia Moreau sat with her usual composure, hands neatly folded over the leather clasp of her handbag, her gaze steady, assessing, as if already seeing the consequences of what had just transpired. "You did well," she murmured, her voice carrying the same quiet finality that had leveled a room full of powerful men just hours ago. Nicholas exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "You exposed them," he said, not sure if he was relieved or simply exhausted. "I only confirmed what was already crumbling," Olivia replied, adjusting the cuff of her coat. "Corruption, Mr. Warrington, is like rot. Once the first crack appears, it only takes a little pressure for the entire structure to collapse." The words were true, but they did little to ease the weight in his chest. The events of the night played out in flashes, Sinclair Hartwell's face blanching as the documents were unveiled, the desperate protests, the moment someone in the crowd turned against him, the chain reaction of revelation, and then, the final act, the arrival of the authorities, the sharp click of handcuffs, and the last look Sinclair had given Olivia before being led away. Not anger, not defiance. Recognition, as if deep down, he had always known this day would come. Nicholas tore his gaze away from the passing countryside. "So what happens now?" Olivia's lips curved, the faintest ghost of a smile. "Now." She tapped a neatly folded newspaper beside her, the morning's headlines already predicting the inevitable fallout. "Now they scramble. The guilty will protest, the powerful will distance themselves, and the world will move on." Her voice was detached, but Nicholas could see the satisfaction beneath the surface, the precision of a woman who understood the game better than those who played it. "And you?" he asked. She reached for her tea, taking a measured sip before answering. "I go home." The answer was simple, yet weighted. Olivia Moreau was not the type to bask in victory. The moment justice had been served, she stepped back, letting the pieces fall where they may. No flashing cameras, no desperate interviews, only the quiet certainty that the truth had done its work. The train pressed onward, the city falling further behind, the air clearing with every mile. Outside, the first hints of dawn bled into the horizon, staining the sky in shades of quiet promise. Nicholas watched as Olivia turned her gaze to the window, her reflection blending into the shifting landscape. A woman who had just dismantled an empire with nothing more than observation, patience, and the undeniable force of truth. A moment passed, then another, and just like that, Olivia Moreau, the woman who had exposed a conspiracy, closed her eyes, as if already moving on to the next mystery waiting to be unraveled.